Welcome to Businesstalk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Florian Lüdeke-Freund as our distinguished guest on podcast today. Before I get started, I'd like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Professor Florian is one of the foremost voices in corporate sustainability today. Based at ESCP Business School in Berlin, he holds the chair for corporate sustainability and serves as a founder and academic director of the MSc in Sustainability, Entrepreneurship and Innovation, a program that bridges bold ideas in academic education with real-world impact. Professor Florian founded the ESCP Star Center for Sustainability Transformation and Applied Research, a dynamic hub where science meets practice. He also served as a senior research fellow at the Bordership Institute for Innovation and Sustainability and has brought his expertise to leading institutions across the globe, including the University of St. Gallen, Stellenbosch University, and Copenhagen Business School. For over 15 years, his scholarship has shaped how we think about sustainable business models, corporate sustainability management, and entrepreneurship for a better world. A prolific and highly cited researcher, Professor Florian served as an associate editor at the Journal of Business Models and deputy editor at Organization and Environment. His work doesn't fill academic journals, it helps organizations reimagine what business can should look like. In today's episode, Professor Florian Lüdeke-Freund joins us to explore the core ideas from his fascinating book, Sustainable Business Model Design, 50 Ways to Innovate for Ecological, Social and Economic Value, that he has co-authored together with Professor Henning Broy and Professor Lorenzo Massa. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Florian to the conversation. Professor Florian, thank you so much for generous gesture of sending me your book. It's a true reflection of your warmth and thoughtfulness. Having you on Businesstalk, it's truly an honor, and we're deeply thankful that you graciously accepted our invitation.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, for the very nice words. So it's an honor to be here today.
Thank you. Professor, your book presents 50 patterns for sustainable business model innovation, a landmark achievement in the field. What was the intellectual spark that made you realize the world needed a pattern-based approach rather than conventional sustainability frameworks?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. So the work on the 50 patterns for sustainable business model design has its origin more than 10 years ago. So we were with a little research group in South Africa, and we were doing research on how business models can help companies create shared value. So back in the day, you remember Porter and Kramer were popularizing this notion of shared value. And businesses were asking the question of how can our business models contribute to creating shared value, which is making a positive impact on society, on nature, but also, bringing in good results for the companies themselves. And when we did this research in 2015, we did a literature review. And we were asking a very simple question, which was what kinds of sustainable or sustainability-oriented business models do exist? So what is the status of the knowledge we have on this special type of business models? And it turned out that there was kind of a mixture of empirical knowledge, case studies, reports about companies, but also theoretical knowledge, ideas about how business models can be greener and more social. And one of our colleagues, Alexandre Joyce from Canada, he proposed that we should look at this from a pattern theory perspective. And a pattern is, it's not that complicated. It's like a problem statement, like how can a company grow its revenues while reducing its ecological footprint? And then the pattern also contains a response or an answer to this problem, which is, for example, to apply, for example, a razor and blade business model in a way that companies can grow their revenues and reduce the ecological footprint. And then as we were working through different cases in the literature, we saw that we can fruitfully apply this pattern approach to, the state of knowledge on sustainable business models. And then we started, to get deeper into the review, collect different patterns, and then, these groups and the different types of patterns emerged from the literature and from our review. And we thought this may be a useful tool, not just for academics, but also for business people.
Professor, you introduced a sustainability triangle as a navigation framework balancing ecological, social, and economic value. In your experience, which of these three dimensions do businesses most frequently sacrifice, and why does that remain such a persistent blind spot?
Yeah. So maybe I can briefly introduce the sustainability triangle, because not everyone listening to this episode or watching this episode is aware of what it looks like. So you can imagine a simple triangle, and every corner represents one kind of value creation, like ecological, social, and economic value creation. And what we found in our patterns research is that different patterns put different emphasis on either ecological, social, or economic value creation. But for the type of patterns we talk about, namely sustainability-oriented patterns, they are very often integrated, like trying to help companies, for example, reduce costs, which would be like an economic or financial contribution, through the reduction of resource use, for example, or through the reduction of waste, for example. And so then you can imagine these 50 different patterns. They sit in different positions on this triangle. If a pattern is closer, let's say, to the social corner, then the assumption is that this pattern is particularly well suited to help companies create social value. For example, by making offerings available at a lower price, providing education, housing, or healthcare, maybe even for free to neglected target groups. And it's the same if a pattern is more closely related to the ecological corner. So then the assumption is that this pattern has a very high potential to help companies reduce their negative environmental footprint. And you're asking for blind spots. So this triangle has a very significant blind spot, which is telling us that we didn't find many patterns that really look at the nexus of ecological and social value creation from a, let's say, more justice-oriented perspective. Because we can also ask the question, is everyone having an equal share in the natural resources, for example? And we didn't find so many business models that kind of help balance the availability of ecological value and, for example, this notion of providing access to otherwise neglected social groups to this ecological value. So that's a significant blind spot. And you're also asking why. And I think that in general, companies struggle a lot for, very obvious and also natural reasons. For example, with measuring social value creation. It's not that easy. It's very often qualitative. It's indirect. Although there are tools like social life cycle assessment, for example, available. But nevertheless, companies struggle a lot with measuring the impacts in the social domain if it goes beyond employees and business partners, and also doing this in tandem with measuring their associated ecological value creation and footprints. So because of a lack of methods and frameworks, I would assume this is kind of a natural blind spot, which we of course have to address in research and practice.
Professor, the patterns are grouped into 11 challenge clusters, from eco-design and closing the loop to giving an ecosystem patterns. If a traditional legacy company could only begin with one group, which would you recommend as the most impactful entry point and why?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I would say, each of these 11 groups is important and relevant and has a role to play. And that's also maybe something I should mention, that this pattern approach is also based on the idea that patterns can be combined and should be combined. Yeah, because an ecological pattern may have a very obvious social blind spot and the other way around. So pattern theory motivates us to combine different patterns to achieve more comprehensive designs, and in this case, business model designs. a recommendation, more like a personal recommendation, would be to maybe start with our new Group 11. So the book we are talking about is the second edition of a book which initially came out in 2022. And this renewed 11th group is about shaping demand. So the business model perspective is per se very company focused. So we look very much at things from the focal company's perspective, but we all know that in consumption, on the user and on the consumer side, there are also very important footprints and issues we have to consider. And Group 11 is containing two patterns. One is about sharing, where the idea is that the more people share assets, cars, devices, even materials in production, the more they can reduce at least their relative environmental footprint. And the second pattern in this group is about sufficiency. So that's a very important sustainability principle. Sufficiency is about, doing well with less, consuming less, producing less, doing less harm. But it's a very underdeveloped and under-researched field because it's so difficult, to motivate companies and help them rethink the value creation logic, which is very often based on producing more, growing, for the sake of making an income, of making a profit, which is per se not a bad thing, but it always comes at the cost of higher environmental and social footprints. And therefore, we are now also highlighting sufficiency as an important pattern that companies can try to draw some inspiration from. How can you make your consumers as happy as before, but maybe they are consuming less material than before? That's kind of the tricky questions of our time.
Professor, closing the loop patterns address circular material and energy flows. Can you walk us through a real-world company example from the book where these patterns transform not just their environmental footprint, but their entire revenue model?
Yeah. So there's an example that we are discussing in the book. It's SodaStream. You made this system which you can use at home or in your office to create or to make sparkling water yourself. You buy a machine, the bubble maker, and then you have to buy CO2 cylinders. And with the help of this machine and the gas cylinder, you can make your own sparkling water whenever you need it. And this model has an assumed environmental advantage if we compare it to situations where you, as a family father, for example, would typically buy a lot of plastic bottles, to have fresh sparkling water at home. In such a setting, this device can help you to save on plastic waste. Yeah, but also on logistics costs, because bottled water is, shipped from A to B, very often long distances. This consumes energy, needs infrastructure, and so on. So the SodaStream business model might sound trivial, but it's a very nice example of how a company, through its technology and business model, can kind of, change our behavior as consumers. And what happens in the SodaStream case is that, of course, the money has to build these devices and the gas cylinders, and they are refillable. They have to be refilled. But still, SodaStream, according to the numbers you find about the company's performance, is earning most of the revenues from the gas cylinders. And this means, or from the refillment of the gas cylinders. And this means that this company is making the majority of its revenues based on a service which is about providing and refilling gas cylinders, which are circulating. So in this business model, the company found a way to help people have sparkling water like before, but without all the plastic waste. Yeah. So their revenue and their growth is tied to this circulating part of the business model, so to speak. And that's a very interesting case. And of course, I know that in certain circumstances, in geographical context, you cannot just use tap water. Of course, that's a totally different debate. But in situations where people have access to bottled water, clean tap water, they have a choice. And that's what SodaStream is supporting. A second nice example, I try to keep it short, is the company Philips, which we all know from various home devices. But Philips is also a producer of complex, high-value medical machines like X-rays and then other machines that are used in hospitals around the world. And Philips many years ago introduced a product line that is based on taking back used machines, refurbishing them, updating them, and bringing them back into use. And according to Philips' own information, they can save up to, if I remember correctly, 80% of the physical material by circulating larger machines, like, for example, X-rays. This means the revenue model is changing in a way that, based on circulating devices, they are making a revenue. And at the same time, they can even offer these machines at a lower price than before. And in this case, they have a very nice business case, which is about opening up a new product line, making more revenue, and at the same time, reducing their relative environmental footprint.
Prof, the book speaks to both managers in established firms and entrepreneurs building from scratch. Do you find that startups are more naturally inclined towards sustainable business model design, or do large corporations actually have structural advantages in implementing these patterns at scale?
So there's no either or answer. It depends. So as you know, small companies, maybe startups, younger ventures, they are very often developed for the purpose of solving an ecological social problem. I see this a lot with my students. So I'm academic director of an entrepreneurship program with a focus on sustainability, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And all my students are very much into building better business models. So there is a lot of motivation, even idealism, many ideas. And now they start experimenting with AI, as a lever, for more sustainability impact. But despite all this enthusiasm and, practical idealism, younger ventures, of course, very often lack resources, which means they depend on finances, on people giving money to these younger ventures to develop and to grow, which also reduces a little bit, the freedom of decision making. So they have to adapt also to the investors, to the banks, or to the funders' expectations. So they may be more dynamic and more idealistic, but they also have to face the realities of what it means to earn money. So this can then limit their ability to, develop and implement radically different business models. On the other hand, for established corporations and larger companies, they are said to have more funds, for example, for R&D, for innovation, for business model and product development. So this is not so much maybe an issue, but here the issue is more about, do people see a business case? Would they believe in changing their business model or developing a new business model? So here it's more about the dominant logics and the mindsets and also the frames that decision makers in larger companies are using when they think about new business models and innovation. And just to add this from an empirical perspective, so we did an empirical study in Germany as Europe's largest industry nation. And we were asking the question whether German companies from the industrial sectors, let's frame it like this, if they are engaging in sustainable business model transformation. And what we found out is that more than half of all German companies have thought about and even implemented changes to their business models based on sustainability considerations. So this doesn't mean that the German economy is green. No, we are not that green as we could be or should be, but at least more than every second, or let's say 50% of all companies have already thought about it and even changed their business models, at least to a certain degree.
Professor, the giving patterns and access provision patterns focus on serving neglected or underserved communities. Skeptics often argue that social mission compromises profitability. How does the book make the business case for these patterns to a CFO or board of directors?
Yeah, so because I have never worked on a board of directors, nor did I have such a conversation with the CFO, I can only, speculate a little bit. And I think there are many angles to this. And maybe let's talk about two approaches that I think are very, very reasonable. One would be to look at this from a corporate social responsibility perspective, classic CSR. So companies have a social responsibilities, and the directors of a company know about the social responsibility, and they know how important it is, to show the community, to show the governments, to show the stakeholders that they do care, about people. So therefore, for reasons of legitimacy, for example, or for reasons of improving reputation, or for reasons of building trust with the community, with society, there might already be a motivation to see this as an investment. Yeah, maybe in a giving activity, like giving away healthcare for free, or paying for others to have access to education offerings. Maybe it's a cost, maybe it's an investment, and there's no real return on investment that you can measure directly. There may still be the assumption that because of the reputational effects, the improvement in legitimacy and so on, that this is worth the investment. Yeah, so it's a kind of a business case rationale. Others, like for example Novo Nordisk, who are in pharmaceuticals, they have turned giving or access provision, in their case it's more access provision, into a real business model, which is they are distinguishing clearly between wealthy industry nations to which they sell their pharmaceuticals and those nations where they know they have the same medical needs, but they have not the same purchasing power. So then a company like Novo Nordisk, can think about how can I still make my pharmaceuticals available to these people? Yeah, maybe not for a super profit, but maybe at a cost covering rate or for a tiny profit. Yeah. So we have many examples like Novo Nordisk, where companies are segmenting the markets or the target groups according to their purchasing power. And this can be a way of, for example, providing pharmaceuticals that are urgently needed, in less developed and in poorer countries.
Professor, you founded the ESCP Star Center explicitly for science practice transfer. What is the biggest gap you still observe between what sustainability research recommends and what businesses are actually willing to implement?
Yeah, I would like to this question also the aspect of what is the research side maybe lacking and maybe not providing. It's not just about the willingness on the side of companies. It's also about the question of what can we as researchers and what do we really deliver that's useful to them. And I'm a sustainability researcher now for around 20 years, and the more senior I got as a professor 10 years ago, I was more and more also asking this question to myself: is it possible for me as a researcher to have an impact beyond teaching? And teaching is, I think, already a big lever. Yeah, we are educating the next generation of decision makers, and I'm very proud of this. But I was also asking whether with my research I could have a bigger impact beyond the classroom. And I know that practitioners are not reading, our research papers. So I am pretty aware of the fact that we researchers, we are writing papers for other researchers. But this doesn't mean that our research is not useful to practitioners. And the STAR Center is an experiment that gives us resources and even a physical space where we can meet with business people, with policymakers, and first of all, listen to them. What are their current concerns? Like in Europe, circular economy, for example, is a big, big topic. Energy security, moving towards, carbon-free energies. So there are all these topics which very often are as well business model topics. And the Star Center is made to make us listen to them, but also to challenge us researchers to talk in a way to practitioners that they can understand. Yeah, and this is working pretty well. So we have events very often with 30, 40, 50 participants, and people really are energized during these events. Yeah, because everybody is trying the best, to listen to each other and to speak a language that people can understand on both sides. And just to conclude this point, one result of this Star Center activity is a project that we conducted with a big energy company here in Europe. And they were asking themselves what they can do to move towards, more circularity in the energy services, but also in the infrastructures. And then we were invited as researchers to do in-house research. And I think this worked pretty well because we were applying our scientific methods, doing interviews, content analysis, inductive conclusions, and so on. And we're able to translate this into a report and a framework and a presentation that really was helping the company to look at itself like looking in the mirror. So at the moment, no projects have really come out of this research, but at least both sides learned a lot and we identified many opportunities for the future.
Professor, creating ecological, social, and economic value simultaneously sounds compelling. But how do companies actually measure whether their sustainable business model is succeeding across all three dimensions? Is there a unified metric or index you advocate for?
In short, no. So we know that there are many frameworks, science-based target initiative, the different frameworks used in the stock market, to measure ESG performance, and so on. Many rankings, indices, and so on. But this is all more on a company level. Some are on a product level. But to my knowledge, there is not a measurement framework that is explicitly at the business model level. And the difference is important because think of a company like, what can we take? Maybe Amazon. Amazon is a very virtual company. It's a very virtual business. And we know that Amazon is running multiple business models in parallel. It's, offering cloud services. It's of course offering, the big online shop, but it's also offering many other things that you can interpret as very different business models that are run by one and the same company. And it would be interesting to be able to measure which of these business models has, for example, the highest eco-efficiency, which means which of these business models is very profitable and at the same time has a very low environmental footprint. This is a totally different way of looking at companies compared to, looking into their annual reports or looking into their ranking in some stock market index, for example. So there are just a handful of researchers that I'm aware of from Sweden, for example, who are currently working on new measurement tools based on life cycle assessment. But that's, at least on the research side, a very underdeveloped field. And I'm really curious to hear if, there is someone out there who is engaging in, the development of business model assessment tools. This would be very exciting.
Professor, as artificial intelligence, IoT, and platform technologies reshape industries, do you see new sustainability patterns emerging beyond the original 50 in the book? And what might the next edition look like?
Very good question. So we have just finished the second edition. And even though it was just adding 5 new patterns to the original 45, it was a big effort, to update the book. And of course, in the updated second edition, we are of course considering recent developments in the field of AI and IoT. For example, how companies who work with produce-on-demand business models leverage, for example, the Internet of Things and digital infrastructures, to be able to produce on demand, which is very much digitally facilitated these days. Or how AI is helping companies with data analytics, for example, to engage in improved sales and distribution activities, which in the very best case are much more eco-efficient. Yeah. The next edition of the book. First of all, I think the three of us, Henning, Lorenzo, and myself, we would like to take a break, at least for, let's say, 1 or 2 years. And then if there is a new edition coming up, then of course it will put even more emphasis on, developments in the field of digitalization and artificial intelligence. And maybe we will then see even, AI-specific patterns, but that's something we have to observe carefully, because at the moment, everybody is into AI and there are big promises and big hopes. And I think we need some time to figure out, what is just fantasy and what is real, particularly in terms of, the sustainability potential of artificial intelligence, because just because we don't see it, it's still there and it's still consuming a lot of resources. Yeah. The data centers are growing just insanely and the energy consumption as well. So that's something we have to have an eye on.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. If a business leader reading your book could implement just one idea tomorrow, no budget constraints, no organizational resistance, what single pattern or principle would deliver the most immediate and meaningful impact for the planet and people?
Yeah. So am I allowed to mention 2 patterns?
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Because 1 out of 50 is difficult. And as I said before, patterns should be combined, right? So there are 2 new patterns in the second edition. One is about decoupling. It's easy to understand that if we would like to maintain, the level of value creation, our income, our wealth, and many countries still have to grow and develop further, right? And at the same time, we know that we already, are beyond most of the planetary boundaries that scientists are measuring these days. We see that there is not so much room left to navigate and to grow in classic physical terms. And therefore, decoupling, which is one of the new patterns, is about the very general principle that while we aim at growing value creation, we must decouple this value creation, or to be precise, the growth of value creation, from resource use, from waste creation, from social inequalities, which means moving more towards, dematerializing the things we do, moving more towards services, moving more towards sufficiency. So decoupling would be the first, and the second would be an extension of the very same thought, which is regeneration. So you are aware, I think, that there's now an upcoming discourse and debate about regenerative economics and regenerative business, which is about not just doing less harm, but rather repairing the harm, or compensating for the harm that has been done in the past, like regenerating ecosystems, woods, water bodies, stopping the loss of biodiversity and, reversing it. And yeah, regeneration is now an emerging principle, and we just don't have to, not just have to decouple, we also have to regenerate. And I would like to motivate business developers, product developers, innovation managers to look into these 2 principles and figure out how they can become guidelines or guideposts for their next generation business models.
Professor Florian, this conversation has been nothing short of inspiring. The way you reimagine what business can truly stand for, not just in terms of profit, but in terms of purpose, leaves us a great deal to think about. On behalf of entire Businesstalk community, we thank you for your time, your wisdom, your research, and your generosity in sharing your work with us. We hope this is just a beginning of a long and meaningful dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here today.